This is the latest version of our Nature Finance at Oxford seminar, which is a seminar series that Nicola Ranger and I founded to become a kind of hub for nature finance research here in Oxford. The idea was, we see a lot of nature finance talks and stuff, but they're often in front of kind of generalist audiences and delivered for generalist audiences. But there is so much detail in this world, and we wanted to go into detail. And so this is designed to go into detail onto specific features of nature finance. I want everybody to come away having learned a lot of stuff, hopefully like new stuff. You've all read Sid's profile, that's why you're here, so I don't need to introduce him, but my perception is that Sid is one of the most intelligent people I've ever met, and so having one of those people working in nature finance world, I think it's a great person to bounce the ideas right on the cutting edge of nature finance off. Sid's written this influential book, The Case for Nature. This is not part of the book tour, right? This is not part of the generic questions about why we should care about nature tour. If you want a generalist's guide to different nature finance strategies, the different ways that we try and give nature value, business models around nature, this is a really good guide. I learned a lot from it, but we're going to go beyond the book today. I think it's basically just an opportunity to go behind the scenes of nature finance with one of its strongest advocates. I've got a bunch of questions from the cutting edge of nature finance that I want to get through, and I'm hopeful then that we're going to be left with half an hour or 20 minutes for questions for Sid from the crowd. Okay, let's start. I've seen a huge amount of variation in the literature on what people define as nature finance. Yeah. So what does it mean for you?
There are two ways of thinking about this. One way of thinking about it is to say, there's only finance, and finance is a tool, it's not an end. Finance is not something that produces anything on its own. You can do things with it, you can finance things, or you can get finance from things. And so in that sense, nature finance is just a flavor of finance that hopefully promotes the protection and restoration of nature and managed landscapes. The other way of thinking about it is a specific set of new mechanisms, whether they're new market mechanisms, new public finance mechanisms, new public-private partnerships, that specifically do something different to the rest of finance. We often use nature finance to mean both those things. And I think for me, the distinction I want to draw is you can call them both nature finance, you can just call them finance, I don't mind. But there are two distinct things. There's one set of things which is really about using the traditional tools of finance, debt financing, equity financing, some combination of those two things, public money for public goods, and using that for the things we care about. And then there's a separate body of work on new mechanisms, and I can talk about some of them if it's helpful, but they should be linked, but we do treat them, in some cases we treat them as different things, in some cases we conflate them. And what I've learned, having actually gone into the finance world and trying to build investment vehicles that directly target all of the things we care about, the first thing I've learned is that there's an incredibly complicated world of finance that doesn't care at all about nature finance. That's where I want to end this question on. This is a vanishingly small part. Climate finance is a vanishingly small part of the global financial system. When you're in it, it can feel like a big deal. I wish it was a much bigger deal, but it's a rounding error in the grand scheme of things. And so we're really talking about how we can make that bigger. And what I would certainly put in the scope of nature finance is public finance for nature.
When I talk with people from maybe slightly outside or adjacent to biodiversity finance world, for me there seems to be a kind of perception, often especially with conservationists, that nature finance is direct investment in nature conservation or restoration. But it's obviously not. You've clarified that it's not. There was this really interesting paper that came out a couple of years ago, Dorian van Raalte and Nicola Ranger's assessment of what actual investments a bunch of the world's leading nature investment funds were actually investing in. Yep. And it was, very interesting. Like, not any of the things that I would consider a conventional nature investment. We're talking certified forestry, we're talking ag tech, these kind of things. Are you able to share any kind of details about what specifically you're investing in within your remit? Like, what do you think are the things that have the greatest potential to deliver nature benefits?
Yeah, and I think to start, the landscape piece, I read that paper. I know Dorian, he's really clever and spent a lot of time figuring this out. The landscape of investing, if you look at where are funds raised and where are they deployed, this point is also worth making. Investment managers don't have their own money. That money comes from somewhere else, and it usually comes from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, university endowments like this one, private wealth from high net worth individuals or family offices. That is the money that is then handed over to managers to say, please try and do something with this according to the mandate that we give you. And the reason that's important to clarify is the uses of that money can be quite strongly linked to the preferences of the allocators of capital. And so the reason in some ways that nature finance in that definition has looked a lot like certified commercial forestry or sustainable agriculture is that traditionally those have been the types of investments which typically involve owning land, by the way. So the first thing is you buy some land, and the land has value that you can realize from it even if your investment doesn't work. So there's an element of downside protection in there. And you might do something different in terms of how you grow timber or commercial crops, which can then generate cash revenue from those crops or timber, maybe some additional upside from other revenue streams like ecosystem services of some sort. But fundamentally, that's an investment strategy that is subscale relative to the rest of it, but is probably the largest chunk of commercial nature finance. And there's a good reason for that. It's relatively low risk to own land in a developed country. You can sell it. And historically, you haven't had to believe in the sustainability benefits to believe in the investment case. So it doesn't take a massive leap of imagination to look at a forestry project that generates high single-digit returns in dollar terms, maybe low double digits in some countries. Is that low or high? Hard to compare. So the way I always think about it is, and you may already be experts, but it's really nice to go back to fundamentals. Your risk-free rate today is 4.5%. Bank of England, 4.5, 4.25 or whatever it is today. You will not lose that money if you put it in. So whatever you're doing needs to be better than that. In normal conditions, you also want to be higher than inflation, significantly higher than inflation, because that also eats away. So the real return needs to be significantly higher than your risk-free rate to even be considered for investment. There are lots of other products that investors can invest in. So if you invest in a public stock and tomorrow you decide you don't like it, you can sell it. If you invest in a forestry asset, you can't sell it tomorrow. You have to hold it to a certain, you have to hold it for several years before it yields any kind of return. You might be able to sell it in a secondary transaction, but that doesn't actually solve the fundamental problem of long hold period. All that to say, real assets is kind of essentially the business of owning land or infrastructure. And it has become a really big asset class, including in the way we build roads and bridges and airports and all of that stuff. And agricultural land and timberland is just part of that. It's just the kind of natural real asset piece. There's a whole set of other investments that are in the private equity bucket. And private equity, in the news, it's only one part of private equity. That's just a bit that focuses on buying up typically kind of mid to large companies, transforming them in some way, and hopefully making them more efficient, but often doing other things as well. That's the kind of buyout type of private equity, but the private equity in general just means you're investing in companies that are not publicly traded. So it's private in the sense that I couldn't go buy it, and you'd have to construct a transaction of some sort, convince the owners to sell you a piece of it, maybe sell you the whole thing. And so venture capital sits within that, growth capital sits within that, the buyout strategy sits within that. Anything that has to do with buying into private companies sits within private equity, basically. What we do at Just Climate is really focused on investing in businesses that are beyond that kind of really early stage, but it's still a long way to go. To give you a few examples, we look at companies that have, and Sophus and I were talking about this, a better solution for pesticides or fertilizers. So we rely on fossil pesticides and fertilizers for the entire agricultural system, basically. We should be able to do better than that, and biology can sometimes replace chemistry in a way that's better and faster and cheaper. There are lots of really interesting technologies coming out of labs all over the world that need to then achieve commercial scale. It takes a long time to get there. At the point where they are there, they still need lots of money to actually go sell the thing, improve it, and eventually make money on it. There's a long period where these businesses are actually losing money year on year and need financing to get to that next stage. That's really what growth equity is about. So these are typically not mature businesses generating huge amounts of free cash. You do have those businesses as well, but they tend to look more like the traditional economy because those are the industries that are at scale. So if you're looking at solutions that can be transformative, they tend to be earlier because that's where they sit in this kind of asset allocation bucket. The thing I do want to say is there's different ways of putting money into companies. You can give them debt, which means you're essentially saying, give me a fixed income in return for whatever risk I'm underwriting. Or you can put equity in the business. There's other things as well, but to simplify, there's equity and debt. And equity really means you're buying a piece of the ownership structure of the company itself. And so when you're in it with the people who founded it and built it and currently run it. You can't sell out. So you can't then, typically you are locked in until that company achieves a certain scale and is able to enter the public markets or be sold to an even bigger company or something else. I would say it's a really crowded space, but it's certainly possible to look around and say, here are 5,000 companies that have made lots of money for their investors. This makes sense. So backing those solutions that currently aren't at scale but could be at scale, and actually showing that they can scale. And in many cases they won't, but that's what it's about.
So what are the kind of professional services, leadership, restructuring services that you might provide to make one of these businesses more effective?
At Just Climate, on the nature strategy, we typically look at ownership stakes of between 5 and 20%. So relatively small. And that goes down over time if you don't keep putting money in, because there are others putting money. As minority investors, you have to be really humble about what you can do, and you have to be useful to founders who typically have challenges. It's with hiring people into their teams who can do certain things. So we have companies that need salespeople to actually go sell to farmers or companies or governments. Often they're also struggling with organizing their teams internally and need help and advice on that front. We have an office in Brazil, and one of the biggest challenges is companies that might be founded in the UK or the US, but need to enter markets like Brazil, and they have no idea where to start. And so we can help with that sort of thing. We can help with some of our partnerships, so we speak to larger companies or governments and make introductions. They also just sometimes want to think through their product and how they can kind of solve technical challenges that exist within that. And we have a specialized team with a bunch of different skill sets, and so it's some combination of those things. I would say it's different from consulting. I have been a consultant in the past. It's quite different because when you're a consultant, you can deliver a piece of presumably good advice and say, off you go. Here, it's sort of your success, financial success certainly, is contingent on them executing on that. It looks and feels very different. I've actually really enjoyed that piece because founders know, in a sense, they know you're investors and you demand a return, you demand commercial scale, but they also know that you're in it with them because you have no way of getting out and you don't get paid. You don't get paid until they get paid. It's always the case. You can see why that's a risky proposition for people who would rather go into different sectors.
Totally, yeah. In your portfolio of investments that all relate to your passion, reducing pressure on nature or restoring nature, how do you, as an investment manager, try and estimate the potential nature or biodiversity benefits of your investments? Presumably they're across such a broad array of actual business types that's actually quite hard to put them in kind of fungible metrics.
The short answer is there's no fungible metric we are not using a fungible metric for biodiversity benefit. At Just Climate, we spent 2.5 years developing a climate impact framework. We're now doing the same on the nature side. There's a long way to go to make that publishable, because the only way to see if a framework works is to test it over and over again with real companies and real entrepreneurs and see if it actually makes any sense. We have a version 1 of that, and I can tell you some of the principles that go into that, but really the core of it is, within the nature theme, we're looking at the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss, which is almost always, in most cases, it's habitat loss. But then you also have overexploitation and pollution and invasive species and climate change. Those tend to be quite tightly linked, but we also look at the resource exploitation in a broader sense. So you can look at water use, you can look at other resources that business models might be consuming that they can consume less of. Ultimately, I think you have to define your metric of interest and then go and figure out how to measure it. So if you're looking at a solution that's, in general sense, not necessarily our strategy, but I went to see a business 2 weeks ago in India. They help smallholder farmers get better biological inputs to grow stuff. And these are really small farmers, between 1 and 5 hectares each. They typically use either no inputs or incredibly low quality inputs that are incredibly harmful for biodiversity and human health, but they haven't typically had access to better inputs. This business essentially goes and delivers those to them and advises them on how to use it and so on, at a cost that is cheaper, back to your point. So they can actually save money doing this and get better yields. But the biggest benefit actually they've seen is that their freshwater withdrawals are cut by a massive amount, depending on the growing system, because the under-application of the kind of misuse of inputs is best counteracted by dumping huge amounts of water into the same systems. Now, how do you quantify that? You might say the metric of interest to me is, in that situation, social benefit, and you might go and try and figure that out. You might actually say the water benefit is the biggest one, given India has a massive freshwater problem. And then you could actually figure out how to measure water savings in that context. So I think the principle we try and apply is to drill down to the level of the company. It's partly why when we've looked at frameworks built for the public markets, it's not been a great fit. The principles are fine, but if you're looking at 5,000 public companies and saying who's good and who's bad, that's a very different proposition to saying, I've got one solution, I know what it does. It's not doing anything bad, I just want to know how much good it's doing. But we have no idea how to actually break that down until we go really deep into companies. And so it's a very different way of measuring impacts. A lot of the literature covers large banks financing nature loss or large consumer goods companies and their supply chains. It's almost the opposite end of the spectrum.
Okay, so are any of your outcome metrics actually something that relates to biodiversity per se? Or are they all changes in pressures or changes in something that are, co-benefits or correlates with biodiversity?
So they can be directly related to biodiversity benefits. But the reason I say this is still in development is it's genuinely still in development, right? The only way to define, get paid for it, ideally. The trouble is always getting paid for it. All of those innovations sit within what I would say the realm of making it easier to get paid for benefits that are public goods, but creating enough of a private benefit that an individual thing, a company, an entity, an NGO could derive private benefit that covers the cost of doing that thing. And so in the book, Blue Forest Conservation, which is a nonprofit in the US, their model is really interesting because wildfires are a huge problem, massive public costs. There is a lot of public money going in there, but it's never enough, and there's never enough to actually stop there's two really big reasons for wildfires. One is climate change and the other is forest management practice. We can only really, local scale affect one of those things, but we're not doing enough of that. So foresting and removing dead wood from forest floors, which we know prevents wildfires, it just hasn't been done in scale. So this organization has figured out a way to essentially take some of the private benefits of fewer wildfires, and the private benefits flow to insurance companies and water companies in the region. And they say, we can deliver you these private benefits if you pay for the public goods. That's the principle. And it's actually working quite well, because in that case, the private benefits are big enough to cover the costs. And the public goods are so vast, for well-managed forests, that everyone benefits. That's not always true. And in other cases, it doesn't add up in the same way. The national asset company model, I think, is one of many ways of structuring corporations to directly value something other than the cash generating potential of crops or timber. Every company in the kind of agriculture value chain is already structured as a natural asset company, in my view, because they rely on natural assets and they create financial benefit from an ecosystem that is hopefully healthy but often isn't. The trouble with some of those models has just been that they haven't managed to shift the ultimate investor mind. So again, back to the original point, asset allocators provide capital to these things through fund managers. If the expectations of the ultimate holders of capital don't change fundamentally, you'll still have to deliver financial returns too. And frankly, these are our pensions, right? It's public money. Most of that money is public money. There's a good reason for fiduciary investment principles. We do want our money to be growing over time, so you and your parents and your grandparents can retire. I think the biggest potential assumption, the assumption that's potentially not valid anymore, is that in a rapidly changing climate and degrading ecology, the assumptions that led us to stable investment returns in the past may not deliver those in the future. But as long as that assumption holds, the preferences haven't shifted meaningfully, and that's what kind of leads to some of these new ideas struggling to scale unless we can find those interesting overlaps where the private benefit is big enough.
I wanted to explore that idea further. To what degree then is biodiversity finance, private biodiversity finance, a second best substitute for government failure?
I think it's a really, really good way of framing the problem, because ultimately we can agree it's government failure, right? It's the kind of root causes of all of these issues, interlinked social and environmental issues, come from failures of public policy. We should all acknowledge that we live in a world where the path to fixing those public failures feels very uncertain, even in countries with functioning governments, let alone countries that do not, and we can think of some big ones. It's just an interesting time, right? So in that context, the first thing I should say is private finance doesn't operate independently of that context, because markets don't operate independently of political context, right? Markets don't just exist. They didn't spring into existence in the year 1 AD and say, okay, we're here now, let's trade. Markets have been built very slowly over time. We've made lots of mistakes along the way, but we have built some really, really, really large markets that span the entire globe, literally, and have broadly managed to keep fraud and the things that come with markets in check. The second part of the question is, what can biodiversity finance do to fix government failure? Not very much. But in those situations where policy conditions allow for private investment or encourage private investment, even simply by changing the rules of regular private investment, simply by saying certain things are not allowed. So if for example, you said deforestation is no longer allowed, demand for sustainable ag inputs skyrockets because you can't deforest anymore. So there'll be a ton of private investment that has nothing to do with governments creating new markets that will just happen as a consequence of certain things no longer being allowed. We've seen that time and again, right? If you think about waste management, it's an industry that simply exists because the government said, we're not allowed to throw your rubbish in the street. There are companies worth hundreds of billions of dollars in waste management. And so that's essentially entirely constructive public policy, and no one questions that. No one says we should go back to a different world. So I think that one is just new regulations that can create demand for sustainable inputs and services. There are situations where governments can also regulate markets for environmental services directly, carbon, biodiversity. You've done a lot of work on B&G, you know how hard it is. But we also know that the policies that sit within the history of things like B&G are really policies that say, if you develop land, if you transform land in some way, you must compensate for it. No one questions that principle. And frankly, no one questions the principle that we do sometimes need to transform land. Right? So if those things are true, then we need to find a way to make it work. And so I think there's some really interesting regulated markets that can exist and can scale. And then finally, I think there's private demand that can be created for services in a changing climate that I think will only escalate. So the demand for resilience and adaptation to climate change, which often just looks like nature-based solutions to agriculture value chains and flood risk and urban heat. These are things that private individuals and companies, it's not a hypothetical thing, they're paying for it today. And I think smarter ways of directing capital to the highest impact solutions that can actually deliver those benefits is absolutely worth looking at. Which is why, maybe my opening was we should expand the definition of nature finance well beyond what we think of as kind of investing directly in conservation projects in the Amazon. And I bring up that example because that case has never worked. It's worked in certain cases, and it's had there are projects that have had some amazing impacts. There are lots of projects that have had zero impact. But broadly speaking, we can agree that that's not worked. And the ultimate driver of deforestation in that landscape is agriculture. And so we have to find a better way to do that. And so if you step far enough back, there's lots and lots of places where I think private finance can have a really meaningful impact without necessarily leaning on policy change. But policy change would be amazing, and we should push for it.
Let's follow up on that thread. So let's talk a little bit about financial regulation. You've been an amazing advocate for the idea that regulations do not have to be restrictive. They can be a driver of innovation, right? Yeah. And there's a whole field of frugal innovation, the idea that a constraint is something to innovate around, right? Yeah. And so I've really admired that view. I'm also conscious that the global financial system is insanely, unknowably complex. Yeah. And so there's always, any intervention in a complex system always runs the risk of kind of unintended consequences, right? So what are the kinds of financial regulations intervening at the system level that you think are things that have mileage, deserve exploration, deserve experimentation, that you have a hunch would actually be effective?
Really, really, really hard question. It's really hard to know what will be effective because the framing is really important. The complexity means so many of the impacts are unknowable. No one knows how this thing works. Because it's a complex system, it's really hard to answer that question or even have a hunch about it. What I can say is markets generally do better on things we care about, social and environmental goods, when there is more transparency. The bits of the financial system where we have the least transparency tend to be the places with the worst abuses against people, against nature. I do think there is some mileage to the idea that not that disclosure changes everything, but disclosure has been extremely powerful from an accounting perspective in not eliminating fraud, but driving it down quite significantly over the last 100 years. The first time we really thought about this properly was in the US, the Depression and all of the reforms to financial markets that took place there in an era of incredible political will. We don't have that today, but it took a huge amount of political will to convince companies that they had to report their accounts every single year. transparently and uniformly, and that they'd have to be audited, and if they did the wrong thing, they could go to court. Like, that was a really controversial idea. And it has managed to actually take root everywhere in the world. I think with climate and nature regulation, we're in the very early innings of that. So it's really hard to judge success right now. I can totally see a world where, with much clearer and more transparent and consistent regulation and political will alongside it, you can then just better assess what's going on, because the truth is we don't know what's going on. So that's one at the kind of system level. I think the other one is just kind of limits. When we think about modern slavery in supply chains, we haven't looked for market-based mechanisms for modern slavery. We've simply said it's not allowed. And we haven't perfectly enforced that by any means, but the starting point was that we should actually punish those who finance this thing. There is an equivalent for deforestation that could be a system-level policy if implemented correctly. Trouble is, that would take a huge amount of political will again. Because again, markets cannot self-regulate. They have no incentive to self-regulate. And so there can be really interesting innovation that looks a bit like self-regulation among leaders, but they will always be in the minority. And if you leave that in a voluntary sense for too long, they will face sustainability costs that others don't face. And so it's not sustainable unless we can bring public policy back in.
I want to talk a little bit about blended finance. Mm-hmm. So the reason that the money doesn't flow into nature restoration or conservation at scale is because it's not profitable, because they don't generate revenues. There are not many mechanisms for capturing the benefits of nature conservation and restoration. So there's a huge amount of discussion in policy world at the moment about the solution to this being blended finance. But then you have studies like Caroline Flammer's work from a couple of years ago demonstrating that for all of the investments for a nature-based solutions investment fund, the investments that went ahead without any government subsidy, they were delivering an internal rate of return of 14.7% a year. And those that were de-risked were still delivering 12% a year, right? So de-risking is not creating revenue streams. De-risking is moving businesses that were not investable or just below the investability threshold to being just above the investability threshold, right? That's what my perception of what de-risking does. How many businesses, in your perception, sit just below the profitability threshold? What role can blended finance play in upscaling investment, and to what degree is it a potential distraction?
The potential distraction, I'm going to start there. It can be if you're working with incredibly constrained public finances. But the question is always, if you're even in those conditions, how do you spend your money most wisely? And so there are examples of blended finance that do have costs, but they're system level costs, like credit guarantees, for example, which don't involve new money. They just involve guaranteeing the debt of, it doesn't really work for early stage companies because it's too risky, but you can guarantee the debt for larger companies that are making transitions. There are some interesting examples of that. That is blended finance in a sense. There is some small increase in your cost of servicing your debt as a result of doing this at scale, but the benefits are quite significant. You're right though, I think the point of blended finance should be to move things over the threshold. One thing to note is the threshold is not something everyone agrees on. And even within teams, people don't agree. Forget organizations and industries. So there is no threshold. Because remember, the return is actually one part of the equation. The other part is a risk, right? So when you look at return, you have to look at the risk-adjusted return. Because remember, the risk-free rate, the return is only 4.5%, and lots of people put money in their bank accounts and get 4.5% and are very, very happy. And so the risk-adjusted return is hard to calculate for nature projects because the risk is hard to calculate for nature projects. And so by de-risking, I truly mean bringing down the risk. So, for all its faults, the restoration in the UK, the government will pay you a grant, depending on where you are, to begin restoring peatlands in Scotland or plant woodland here. You have secure land tenure. You can find revenue streams, whether it's timber or carbon or recreation or whatever you want to do with that piece of land. And typically the cash yield on that land is very low. So the opportunity cost is very low. And so you can create conditions where actually it makes a lot of sense for private money to come in. It's much harder in geographies, specifically countries, where no amount of de-risking can tip it over the edge. So I think the reason it hasn't scaled is there's not a lot in just under the threshold, wherever the threshold is. I will say kind of direct nature restoration in countries with relatively stable political systems, like Brazil, could actually benefit from a lower cost of capital. So if restoration projects could access debt at 2%, even if it was only a small slice of debt, or if it's debt with a very long, payback, a big, payment holiday before you start paying off your debt. That's also blended finance. It could really help, because I think the amounts of money you need are huge, and they're hundreds of millions of dollars for at-scale restoration. There are some companies, really high integrity companies, that are pretty close to that, but they're not quite there, and lower cost debt would really help. But there are only a few examples of that type of situation. There are lots of countries where it makes a lot of sense to restore, but unfortunately, no amount of very low cost debt will make it investable in a truly commercial sense.
Thanks so much, Sid. I've got more questions, but I wanted to leave 20 minutes for questions from the audience.
Yes, please.
So we'll go back to my questions if there isn't questions that are coming from the audience. But now it's your turn. Sid, please go ahead, pick your questions.
My understanding of how private investors invest in nature-based or climate-based solutions is saying, okay, well, it has to pass some threshold of good for the environment, good for nature, good for biodiversity, and above that, all we care about is rate of return, because fundamentally we are held liable to our investors. Is that accurate? Is there a way that you're really quantifying biodiversity benefit? How do you make that assessment between not just rate of return, but also nature benefit?
First of all, there are not that many nature investors. So it's a small sample size, and everyone does it differently. There are thematic funds that will explicitly focus on commercial risk-adjusted returns with demonstrable biodiversity benefits, but that second piece is actually, as you say, secondary to the first thing, right? The way I would frame it isn't, I want to maximize return. Depending on the asset class, if you're a debt investor, you agree the rate of return at the beginning and you hope they pay you back. That's all you do. There's no more maximizing to do. If you're an equity investor, you can help these companies as much as you can and hope for the best as a minority equity investor. But again, there's not maximizing to be done there beyond selection. So you select for companies that you think could work, but inherently you don't know that much about the future. There's a huge amount of guesswork in investing. The more important thing is, with the mandate you have, if you have a real assets mandate, which means I can buy land and I'm aiming for 10%, what you actually manage for is risk. You're not aiming for 30% from land, because you can't get 30% from land. But what you're aiming for is, can I be sure that that 10% will be in my pocket in 10 years' time? And so often you try and look for land that is in a stable climate, and you look for good operators, and you then embed sustainability practices. That's actually how it's done. And so depending on the mandate, you can explicitly target. So at Just Climate, we're explicitly focused on the highest impact climate and nature solutions. We have a fully performance adjusted carry. I won't go into that, but what I mean by that is financial returns fill up the bucket for incentives, but they only get paid out when the climate benefits get paid out. The nature framework is in development, but all to say that linking of performance fees with impact of some sort has been done in different ways. All of it will be imperfect because we're trying to make sense of complex systems, but directionally they certainly push you to look at things with that lens. But it's really important to remember that the first layer is there's no money to be paid out if there's no money made. Right? So all of this stuff relies on having some investment case in the first place. And so really the way that works is you simply don't look at a lot of things because they have no prospect of making money.
Okay, at the very back.
Back to your last point on the blended finance and kind of that idea of kind of a very, very low cost of debt would really bridge the gap for a lot of these companies. Is there something or any standard practices from a technical assistance perspective that you find would really help or have helped certain companies that you're familiar with kind of bridge the gap, and any things that any other tools that the public bodies in blended finance deals provide to actually help that, or is it really just lowering the cost of capital?
For me, that's the biggest one. There is a separate thing called technical assistance, which is really paying for R&D. It's a fancy way of saying paying for R&D. And so because R&D doesn't always deliver benefits, it's inherently high risk. Investors often say, I don't want to be paying for R&D. So give you a specific example. There are lots of companies in Latin America that are saying, we need to develop better genetic material for native species. Because we've done it for eucalyptus, it grows really quickly, but we did that over 50 years. Can we please do that for native Amazonian trees? That takes years of work and it may not work. And so technical assistance that could really work because it can help pay for public research effectively that you can then build companies on if it does end up happening. There are lots of examples in the ag space. So why did crop yields go up so much? Public research agencies around the world spent huge amounts of money improving crops and then said, here you go, now you can grow. And there are some commercial businesses built on that, but it's also eventually spilled over into the general system. So that's another way you could do that if you say, here's a targeted problem. So for example, the building of nurseries is stuck in the 20th century. We need to do this better. You could fund a big technical assistance facility on that. And I think it would be really high impact actually in the context of what we just discussed, because it's really hard to do that. And we might as well solve it once in a pre-competitive way and then let companies compete on delivering high quality projects rather than figuring out something that ultimately the industry needs to figure out.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, please.
So I want to actually just go back to Sophus' last question on finance for a moment.
Good question.
Because the one thing that stands out to me is that it is a static framework. It doesn't look at the dynamics of it at all. Whereas, of course, if you're an investor, you're interested not only in the first period, but this is
Correct.
usually those blended finance deals are like several years up to decades.
Correct.
Really. And so my question to you is, beyond using concessional capital to just crowd in more investment because of that rate, wherever it sits, but more importantly, is there learning effects? Are there demonstration effects? Is there something about the novelty of the sector that, beyond classical financial risk, would be important for these investors? My second question is, where do we draw the boundary between a more classical private-public partnership, so where we just infinitely subsidize a private company to provide a public good, as opposed to blended finance, which is considered more sort of like a short-term sort of getting them off the ground?
Let's just start by saying we spend $7 trillion of money, public money spent on subsidies that actively degrade nature. So the baseline is we pay for public harm, by and large. Right? So even if you're paying, I debate this with Sophus all the time. I think we should be applying less stringent additionality tests on public finance, because as long as we stop doing bad stuff, that's already good. Right? Even if the good stuff is only good stuff 20% of the time, I think it's still, relative to the baseline of active harm, this is really good. Again, we should aim for better additionality, we should aim for better targeting, but starting point, even if it's 0, and we just stop doing the bad thing, and then just simply use the money to directly put money into the pockets of consumers who want to help, that's good. Your first question, I think you're right, that is the right way to frame it. So learning rates are used in a slightly different way in climate technologies to actually show the a fall in the cost of solar panels, for example, which ultimately was kickstarted by public money, creating demand. That then created massive supply and drove down the cost and so on. We do need to see that in lots of other industries. So we can agree that we need public money to kind of do that first thing. There's learning rate in that sense. The novelty thing, I think, applies where it works. But it also, interestingly, applies in some cases where it doesn't work, where we had, for example, there was a wave of, wave is a great right word, because wave energy was, some of you will remember it, right? But 10, 15 years ago, that seemed to be on the horizon as a big new source of energy. It's still possible, technically feasible, just very hard to do in practice. And a lot of public money was quote unquote wasted on that. But ultimately, it's shown us that it's hard to do, and we've found other ways to get cheap, clean energy. So it's not all wasted money, even if it doesn't work, is my only point. And public money will sometimes be wasted.
Yes, please.
In terms of, you're talking a bit about lack of disclosure and the effects of transparency and that. I think with private markets, it can be quite a creative thing, especially in these new areas. And as much as that probably interests you as an investor personally, then if you were sort of talking to your own investors, how do you convince them that you can actually scale up?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to know that the baseline is almost no measurement. And asset allocators tend to only measure the financial performance of products with safeguards, right? So with minimum safeguards that meet regulatory requirements, absolutely. All the high quality asset managers, asset owners do that. But the demand for sustainability performance measurement in a positive sense is only just beginning, because the field is only just beginning, right? So in a sense, we have to build the plane as we fly it, and the default in the kind of investment landscape tends to be, prove to me that you meet all of the requirements. In some cases you might exceed them, but broadly speaking, the metric of interest is financial performance.
Yep.
On this idea of will, can you reflect a little bit on public will, how that drives trends in the markets, and how that also drives political will? Because theoretically, both are incredibly responsive to the individual and the individual's preference, right?
Theoretically.
I don't know if it's always that way in reality.
Yeah. Markets for consumer goods and services are more responsive to public will than politics is. I think that's fair to say. The others' preference is now shaped by advertising and marketing and lobbying, yes, of course, but express preference versus what you're delivered, actually pretty high correlation. So like, if you think about consumer trends for stuff, it's very responsive to the preferences. Fashion is a great example where it's entirely based on the preferences of consumers, highly responsive, and at great environmental cost often, but it happens. And I think the reason for that is the companies that sell you stuff live or die by whether you buy stuff. And so the transmission mechanism is the cycle is very short and directly financial. And they can say, okay, we want something else, I'll give it to you, or someone else will give it to you. The trouble with political systems, and you definitely know more about this than me, is you're aggregating lots and lots of different preferences into a set of policies, back to like with land use, for example, where you have different interest groups that want different things, often very sincerely. And there is not an easy way to trade those off, and truly make everyone whole. The one bright spot maybe is where it only really works with single issues, but they can be quite powerful. So I think there have been political moments that have caused big shifts. And whenever those come, we should take them and use them. There are a few topics that cut across the political spectrum. I think nature happens to be one of them. I think on some level, I think humans are biophilic and feel the loss of nature, and there is greater kind of, not just awareness, but a kind of deep desire to live within thriving ecosystems, including ecosystems close to home. It's partly why I think restoring landscapes in every country is important, even if you can't control the world. But the other one is pollution and toxic chemicals and microplastics and PFAS, and the personal health concerns can actually align quite nicely with lots of other public goods. And we can do things there on the back of political moments. So we should use those, I think.
We're out of time. I had a great time. I hope you learned something. I learned a huge amount. Sid, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.